to welcome again Natalie Hungate and tell you a little bit about her. She recently completed her MA in European Studies here in Bonn at the Center for European Integration Studies, which happens to be our neighbor in Genscher Allee. The Zeit, in its Future of Europe Observer, also recently published an article of her on the topic of the joint UN-EU gender equality initiatives. And pending on a decision of our institute, on our board, Ms. Hungate may also be teaching a course in our BA program during the upcoming summer term entitled Queer Rights in the US, What's Next After Marriage Equality. Ms. Hungate obtained her BA in International Studies and German with a minor in Women and Gender Studies from the University of South Carolina, where she also worked as an intercultural advisor to college athletes from 2015 to 2018. In 2017, she spent a semester abroad at the University of Bamberg, and I suppose that was part of the motivation to come back. But she also served as a volunteer at clinics in Latin America several times. So I think you have a lot of international experience and competence. At the University of South Carolina, she received various scholarships and won an Outstanding Senior Award as well as a Student Leadership Award in 2018 for her academic achievements and social commitment, respectively. And finally, she's a member of a number of honor societies, among them Pi Beta Kappa. Is that spelled? Pi Beta Kappa.
Pi Beta Kappa, yeah.
Yeah, Kappa. Thank you very much. Ms. Hungate's talk tonight is based on her MA thesis, which was entitled Equal Rights and Recognition for LGBTQ plus couples in European Union law. It's not all rainbows and sunshine, but the sky is clearing. To make things more topical for a presentation in our lecture series, her talk tonight includes the situation in the United States, while both the US and the EU, as Ms. Hungate wrote in her abstract, and I quote, are often depicted as global forerunners for human rights and equality. Careful examination from the perspective of LGBTQ plus couples reveals gaps in human rights protection laws, along with serious flaws in the judicial systems and governments. End of citation. Marriage equality was achieved in the US in 2015, as you may know, via Supreme Court ruling in the Obergefell versus Hodges case. However, it's still difficult. LGBTQ plus individuals are not equal when it comes to healthcare rights or family rights, for instance. In Europe also much has been achieved in the last decades, yet same-sex marriage continues to be constitutionally banned in 7 member states, all of them in Eastern Europe, 5 of which also do not recognize civil unions between same-sex partners. But you know much more about this, and we are all very curious to hear more from you as an expert on these issues. So please welcome with me Natalie Hungate.
Thank you for the warm welcome. I'm Professor Dr. Siegel, and thank you again to the North American Studies Department for allowing me to give this lecture this evening. Quick question, can everyone in the back hear me? Okay, awesome. So first to get started, the introduction basically said it all regarding my background, so I'll move directly into the lecture. This topic will cover LGBTQ plus couples in Europe and the US. It's not all rainbows and sunshine, but the skies are clearing. To first start out, we'll go through a quick lecture outline. First looking at introduction to LGBTQ, what do all of these letters mean? Important definitions before moving into the EU versus the US in regards to same-sex marriage. We'll look at how the US achieved marriage equality in 2015, before looking at the status of same-sex marriages and partnerships in the EU. And then finally, we'll look at the EU and the US in regards to future outlooks and what is ahead for LGBTQ couples in both of those countries, both the US and the EU. First, an introduction to LGBTQ+. It is an acronym used to describe individuals who fall outside of societal norms in regards to sexual and gender norms. LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. And then the plus symbolizes other identities, such as asexuality, intersexual, intersex, and pansexual. So I'm going to assume everyone here knows what a lesbian is and what a gay man is. Bisexuality can sometimes be a bit more hard to define for some people. For the purpose of this presentation, we'll look at it as the potential to be attracted romantically and sexually to people of more than one sex and or gender, not necessarily in the same way, at the same time, or at the same degree. Transgender, I will get back to in 2 slides. We'll look at definitions regarding sex, gender, and sexual orientation. Queer is a term, at least in the US, if you were from my mother's age bracket, so who was born in the 50s, is a bit known as a slur word. In the 50s, it was used to define someone who didn't fit in the societal norms. So, for example, if somebody was doing something that wasn't considered quote-unquote normal, you would say, oh, why are you being so queer? The LGBTQ plus community has since reclaimed that term and uses it as an umbrella term to describe anyone who is basically not heterosexual, anyone who fits outside of this quote-unquote norm. And as I said, the plus symbolizes other identities and is used to make the acronym more inclusive. Some people also use LGBTQIA+, and eventually it just gets very complicated with all of the letters to continue adding on for all of the different identities. So the plus is used to be inclusive for all sexualities and gender identities. So first we're going to look at sex. So sex is defined as a biological term used to categorize whether someone is male or female, and it's generally assigned to an individual at birth based off their physical anatomy, specifically their genitals. So generally if someone's seen with a penis, it's generally considered male, and with a vagina, it's generally considered a female. An important identity that kind of defies this binary that most of society identifies with is intersex. And it's basically a term used to describe people who do not fit into the reproductive categories that we know or chromosomal pattern. And so they can't be classified as stereotypically male or stereotypically female. It's important to note that intersex is not a sexual orientation. It has to deal with, it's not about someone's romantic attraction or sexual attraction. It deals with their reproductive and chromosomal patterns. So next we'll look at gender and sexual orientation. So gender and sex are often switched and used interchangeably. However, sex refers to socio-historical and culturally constructed roles and attributes given to people based off of their sex. And this is where it's easier to define transgender here, which is often shortened to trans. It's a person whose gender identity does not match the gender assigned to them at birth. And gender identity is someone's internal held sense of gender. And then sexual orientation encompasses one's romantic, sexual, and or emotional attraction to others. Sexual orientation is, for example, lesbian, gay, bi, pan, ace. These would be sexual orientations. Transgender is not a sexual orientation. Again, it involves gender identity, which is continually held under the LGBTQ plus umbrella because it does not fit into the societal norms on gender and sex. So, next we'll look at, now that we've gone through the definitions, the EU and the US same-sex marriage. So the US and the EU are often in political science compared to one another because of the fact they both involve federal systems. So you have the EU institutions, there's 7, and then you have the US federal government, and then you have states below. In the US states meaning, so for example, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, New York, and then in the EU states refers to the member states, so Germany, the UK until they Brexit or not, and other groups. And so they're really great to compare a lot of times for political scientists because of the fact the EU is very unique in how it's built because it's a union of separate countries, and the US is also unique in that it's a union of so many different states. And within both entities, with the EU and for the US, each individual country for the EU side or for states in the US have certain competencies, so certain abilities that are only granted to them and not to the above government. So they're very interesting to compare. First, we'll look at the US in regards to same-sex marriage. So as of 2015, same-sex marriage is legal in all 50 US states, the District of Columbia, and US territories. But the question becomes, how did we get here? Because it's obviously not that simple. So how did the US achieve marriage equality? This is a lovely picture from the 2000 Millennial March. This is a counter-protester. The US actually in the last 20 years had support of same-sex marriage change in 1996 from only 27% to in 2015 up to 61%. So in a span of about 20 years, it almost tripled in some aspects. But the question is then, how did we get from this lovely man and his poster to modern day same-sex marriage? So in the US from the 1600s to the early 2000s, states had various laws in regards to same-sex and in general sexual activities. Each state worded it a bit differently. Some banned bestiality, some banned sodomy, some banned same-sex sodomy, and some banned buggery. What do all of those mean? Sodomy refers to anal intercourse or oral intercourse. Bestiality refers to sex between a man and a beast or an animal. And then buggery actually comes from English law. The English had a law from, I believe it was the Buggery Act of 1553, which stated that two men could not commit the act of anal intercourse. And most states kept or took the buggery law from England after the Revolutionary War when they were rewriting all of their state constitutions. As it was pointed out, I studied in South Carolina. I took a course on criminal law in South Carolina. They actually do not use, they don't have a sodomy law, they have a buggery law. Ironically enough, they don't define what buggery is in their law. They just said it's the abominable act of buggery. That's it. So the abominable act of buggery is banned, and if you do it, you're going to prison for 5 years and have a $500 fine. Cool, but it still doesn't say what it is. Sodomy, again, what's interesting with the US is some states actually banned same-sex sodomy and some banned sodomy completely. So it didn't matter if it was two people of the same sex, two people of the opposite sex, it was completely banned. But by 2002, 36 of the 50 states had either overturned through legal processes or just invalidated their own sodomy laws. However, it wasn't until 2003 that the full decriminalization throughout the entire US in regards to same-sex sexual activities occurred. And that was from the case of Lawrence v. Texas, which went before the Supreme Court. Quick summary of that case, basically there was a man named Lawrence who was at his home entertaining a male lover, and he had a ex-partner who knew the guy was there and called the cops on them saying that someone was trying to break into the house. So of course cops come in the US with their guns, blaring into the house and catch the two men in the act of anal intercourse. So both men are strapped with sodomy charges and face fines before the system. Both decided to appeal through the different levels of the court systems, and in the end, the US Supreme Court ruled that that it was illegal to prohibit private homosexual activity between consenting adults. It overturned the Bowers v. Hardwick case, which was only about 20 years earlier, which upheld prohibiting same-sex sexual activity in private, and it rendered all state sodomy laws null and void. After that, we moved to it took a decade for the next major case to come before the Supreme Court, and that was the case of United States versus Windsor. Here you see Miss Edith Windsor. She's affectionately referred to in the US as Edie. And President Barack Obama, this is from after the case went before the Supreme Court. And a little bit of backstory about Edie and how she ended up at the Supreme Court. Edith Windsor met a woman named Taya Spire in the early 1960s. They started dating in 1965 and were together ever since. In 2007, Spire's health was failing, and the two wanted to get married. They lived in New York City, where same-sex marriage was not allowed, so they crossed the border into Canada and married in Toronto. The problem was, at the time in the US, there was a law in the books called DOMA, which stands for Defense of Marriage Act. It passed under Bill Clinton in 1996, and it defined at the federal level marriage between a man and a woman. That was all marriage could be under the federal level. And it also meant that it did not require states to recognize other states' same-sex marriages. So for example, if Massachusetts allowed same-sex marriage. New York was not required to recognize anyone's marriage from Massachusetts or any other state if it did not want to. And that caused problems for the mobility of LGBTQ couples. Basically, you had to move to another state that recognized your marriage, or you were kind of screwed. Even once New York recognized same-sex marriages from other jurisdictions, at the federal level, Edie and Teo's marriage was not recognized. Sadly, in 2009, Speyer died and left her estate to Windsor, which is eventually what ended up leading her to the Supreme Court. Under US law, if you are a surviving spouse, you have the ability to apply not to pay federal taxes when you inherit someone's estate. So regardless of how much money it is, you get it tax-free. The problem is that because of DOMA, the federal government didn't recognize the same-sex marriage, regardless of if New York did, and told Miss Windsor that she was going to have to pay over $300,000 in federal taxes. About the euro equivalent would have been 280,000 euros. And she originally paid the taxes, however, then realized, wait, something's wrong with this, and sued the federal government. And luckily the Supreme Court ruled that Section 3, which is the part of the Defense of Marriage Act that stated marriage was only between a man and a woman, was in breach of due process and the 14th Amendment. What exactly does that mean? Due process is the idea that in the US that the government, so both federally and at a state level, cannot deny an individual the rights to life, liberty, and property. And what that means is, for the Supreme Court, marriage is considered a fundamental right. It's a part of your right to life, is to marry. And so the fact that the federal government was putting its hands on your marriage and saying, oh yeah, no, that state, you as a state can't recognize another state's marriage, that doesn't work, we're not recognizing it, was a big no-no. So the Supreme Court said, struck it down, so DOMA basically was rendered null and void, and it opened up the possibility for the next case to come. She's meeting with President Obama here because after Windsor's case, she actually, President Obama opened up federal workers the opportunity to access rights for same-sex couples that had been denied to them before. Veterans benefits were open for same-sex couples. Green cards were now open for same-sex couples. It started a whole wave. Also, this ruling started a whole wave of lawsuits against couples, against states that ban same-sex marriage, which led to the next case of Obergefell v. Hodges. Obergefell v. Hodges is an interesting case because it directly links to Windsor. Obergefell is actually, you can see him, he's in with the green file folder, if you can see him there. He and his lifelong partner, John Arthur, saw the Windsor ruling and were both like, let's get married. We haven't done this, like, we've been together since 1992, let's get married. And so they both decided to get married. There were two problems. First, they lived in Ohio, which did not allow same-sex marriage at the time. Second, John Arthur, unfortunately, had been diagnosed with ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, which meant he was bedridden. And so he couldn't stand. So they had to figure out a very creative way to get married, which was they went on Facebook, like everyone does, and asked friends and family for help, raised money, got an ambulance to drive them from their home in Ohio to the airport in Ohio, fly from Ohio to Baltimore, Maryland, where same-sex marriage was legal, in a medically equipped airplane, and then married on the tarmac in the plane. Super simple, right? But these were the hurdles that you had to jump through in order to have just the same marriage rights as someone who was a heterosexual couple. The problem was, once they got back to Ohio, Ohio said, yeah, we're not recognizing your marriage. Nice trip. Hope you had fun. Which was a really big deal because at this point, John Arthur, as I said, was terminally ill and basically was on the verge of death. And he wanted to make sure Jim, his love of his life, was able to get his pension and also be listed as his surviving spouse, which meant also that he would then have access to not having to pay the taxes like Windsor had to. And so they both decided to file in court. They weren't the only couple. Multiple other couples filed. Obergefell v. Hodges just became the lead case. Sadly, John Arthur died before the case hit the Supreme Court, which is why you only see Jim in all of the pictures. And yeah, it was a bit of a messy start. Luckily though, the judge, right before John Arthur died, allow Jim to be listed as a surviving spouse. So that was a really great thing, at least that John Arthur got to see before he died. The case was one of the biggest at this point for LGBTQ rights and equality in the US. And then it went before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with Obergefell and stated that according to the Due Process Clause, which we talked about the last time, and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, same-sex couples are guaranteed the right to marry, which automatically made marriage equality the law of the land in all 50 states, US territories, and the District of Columbia. And you had to then also grant all of those couples the same obligations and rights given to married couples, to heterosexually married couples. Marriage, again, the Supreme Court, thank goodness, always thinks marriage is considered a fundamental right. And this means government is hands-off to marriage, and your right to marry is inherent to your freedom as a human being and being in a free society. So the Supreme Court basically said, it's a violation of your right to life, liberty, and property to not be able to get married. So luckily the court case went as it did. You can see this is the Obama White House. I don't think Trump would do this. This is the Obama White House after the ruling. They lit it up as the rainbow flag. So obviously then everything was hunky-dory and same-sex marriage went across the land and nobody objected, or we didn't have any problems. No, that didn't happen. So following the ruling of Obergefell v. Hodges, governors, so the leaders of each individual state in the US, both ordered their county clerks to begin issuing same-sex marriage license. A county clerk in the US is someone who records all paperwork regarding a county's population. So birth certificates, death certificate, marriage certificates, they're the one who handles all the paperwork. This is Kim Davis. This is the example of basically the most well-known example of not following the Supreme Court's ruling in the US. She served in Rowan County in Kentucky starting in 2015 as the clerk of course. And basically two men who wanted to have a same-sex marriage came up to her and said, we would like one, and she said no. And when asked why, she explained that Kentucky law required that county clerks issue marriage licenses in their own names. And she did not believe in same-sex marriage. She believed it went against, as she quoted, the authority of God. So, so she declined, and rather than then get accused of being homophobic, she just denied everyone marriage licenses. So it didn't matter if you were same-sex, opposite sex. She said, I'm not doing it. So it was a bit of an interesting moment. 6 couples, both heterosexual and homosexual, both came together and said, yeah, well, this is BS. And went to the federal judge, and the federal judge of the 6th Circuit ordered Davis and her clerks to issue licenses. She said no again, so he threw her in jail for contempt of court. She spent 5 days in jail, then the judge finally let her out. She returned to work and slightly illegally edited the form so it no longer had her name on it, and then started issuing marriage licenses. So finally, in September of 2015, you could get your marriage license. The previous decision was in June, so it took basically 3 months for these couples to be able to get access to marriage after the Supreme Court ruling came through. Remember this face, we will come back to it later. So now we've talked about marriage equality in the US. So we have this nice map where it's all one color, all the same, very easy to understand. Then we come to the EU. So currently 28 member states, with England if it figures out what it wants to do. And there's 4 color categories, in case you can't read the top. Green, there's 6, that's where same-sex marriages are legal. There's red, there's 6, that's where same-sex marriages and partnerships are illegal. There's 8 countries in orange where there's same-sex marriages and partnerships are legal. And then there's 8 where only same-sex partnerships are legal. So how did we get here? We'll do a quick history. So from 1791 to 1998, various modern-day EU member states started to decriminalize same-sex sexual activities. I was actually really surprised when I did this research. France decriminalized in 1791. I was really surprised. Cyprus was the last in 1998. But just because they decriminalized same-sex sexual activities didn't mean that there wasn't any other hindrance. A lot of these countries then made separate ages of consent. So same-sex sexual activity, age of consent would be, so for example, 22, and opposite sex would be 16. So they still tried to make it difficult or a way to penalize someone for participating in same-sex sexual activities. 1989, Denmark became the first EU member state and the first country in the world to allow same-sex partnerships, and in 2001, the Netherlands became the first EU member state and this first country in the world to allow same-sex marriages. And this is a picture of one of the first ceremonies in the Netherlands once same-sex marriage was allowed. So a breakdown of countries, as I said, so same-sex marriage is legal in Denmark, Finland, Germany, Ireland, Portugal, Sweden. Same-sex marriages and partnerships are legal in Austria, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, Malta, Netherlands, Spain, and the UK. Same-sex partnerships are legal in Croatia, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Greece, Hungary, Italy, and Slovenia. And same-sex marriages and partnerships are illegal in Bulgaria, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia. Interesting thing with the last 6 for same-sex marriages and partnerships are illegal. Most of those countries either have in their constitutions or actually in their legal code that same-sex marriage is illegal, or they define specifically marriages only between a man and a woman. One of my interesting stories I find is Croatia. So Croatia actually allowed same-sex partnerships, they passed it, and then the next year had a constitutional referendum and banned same-sex marriage. So they took one step forward and then immediately took one step back. Of the 6 countries that allow same-sex marriage, 5 of them previously allowed partnerships. That's Denmark, Finland, Germany, Ireland, and Sweden. So those 5 countries, once they allowed same-sex marriage, pulled partnerships because for them, marriage, heterosexual was enough of a partnership ability. It put everyone on the same foot. So they just only had one type then of relationship bonding under the law. So again, we have this really pretty map. So how do we get there legally under EU law? That's another interesting tidbit. I'm not going to read you all of this, I'll summarize. But so the EU currently is under the Lisbon Treaty. It's a reformed treaty. It reformed the treaties that came before. And this means that it has 2 treaties, main documents, and that's the Treaty of European Union. It does not mention sexual orientation, same-sex, LGBTQ, any of this. And the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union mentions it twice, and it says the aim of the European Union is to combat discrimination on a multitude of characteristics, including sexual orientation. And Article 19 gives the Council, when it acts with the European Parliament in a special legislative procedure, the ability to take action to combat discrimination based on multiple characteristics, including sexual orientation. So the question though is, when you have these documents, why then does the EU not as a whole then have access to same-sex marriage or marriage equality? The answer lies in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, it starts off very nice, human dignity is inviolable, everyone has the right in respect to his or her family and private life, and then you hit Article 9. Article 9, the right to marry and the right to found a family shall be guaranteed in accordance with the national laws governing the exercise of these rights. Basically what that means is each member state determines its own marriage right law and its family right law. So in that instance, the EU cannot tell Romania, cannot tell Poland, you have to allow same-sex marriage. That's in their own jurisdiction, that's under their own competencies. And that's basically the kicker that kind of puts an end to the EU as an institution forcing same-sex marriage on all member states. Ironically enough, there's also an article that says everyone is equal before the law. Then we go into Article 21 that basically says any discrimination based on any ground, and there's a whole list, shall be prohibited. It's open-ended, however, because of Article 9, it's basically everything except for marriage and family. Important to note also with Article 9, they separate marriage and family, which means theoretically a state could allow same-sex marriages, but then deny a same-sex couple the right to adoption or something like that, because they're considered 2 separate entities. So then what did the EU do, or what does the EU currently have that actually helps LGBTQ couples? It's this directive, and a directive in the EU is a legislative act where the only thing that's mandatory is the goal. So the EU doesn't care how you get there as long as you complete the goal. And with this, the goal was to combat discrimination on the grounds of religion, belief, disability, age, and sexual orientation in regards to employment and occupation. So basically, most of the court cases and most of the big stories revolving LGBTQ individuals in the EU revolve around employment, because this is the document that they can use to really go at discrimination or go at member states or entities that they feel have wronged them. So, as I said, this is the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg City. So again, most cases have involved around employment, which generally means it's involved around employment benefits which have been denied to LGBTQ couples. There's been an increase in cases, especially since the 90s. So these are the main cases that have come before the court, and they all again involve benefits. So the cases of Maruco, Paris, Romer, Dietrich, and also Hay all involve specifically the previous Equal Employment Framework Directive. Grant occurred, unfortunately, before that employment directive was passed. Her result in her case was not as positive, and actually in this case, it was members of the EU staff suing the EU for discrimination based on sexual orientation. So apparently it wasn't following its own rules. But in the case of Grant, it was on travel concessions. There was a woman who worked for Southwest Trains outside of Southampton in England, and she wanted, her company had a policy that if you were married or had been in a long-term relationship for 2+ years, you had the ability to apply for free travel concessions for your significant other if they were of the opposite sex. She sued because she had a female partner, and she said it was discriminatory based on sex because it required a specific sex to be able to get the benefits. The EU Court of Justice interpreted it a bit differently. They said, well, the company said they would discriminate against it if it was 2 guys as well, so like, no. So they completely said, yeah, no, not our problem, sorry. Unfortunately, so that went kind of south for her. In the case of D in Sweden versus the European Council and W versus the European Commission, it was both members of EU staff who were denied household allowances. They were in partnerships. The household allowances were based off of marriage. They complained, I can't get married in my state, so my partnership has to be considered the same as a marriage. In the first case in '99, they said no. A decade later, they reversed. So slowly you see them start to move and change their decisions. In Maruco and in Paris, both were over the denial of widowers or survivors' pensions. In the case of Maruco, it was a widower's pension. He was trying to get his husband worked for in the German theater system, and he wanted to get his retirement from that. And for Paris, he worked for the university system in Dublin, and he was trying to get survivors' pension for his surviving spouse should he pass. In both cases, Paris in particular is very interesting because it's the first case that was argued on 2 bases of discrimination: age and also sexual orientation. Unfortunately, Paris didn't win. The ECJ interpreted basically that you have to be discriminated on one characteristic that can stand alone. You can't combine characteristics. So it's interesting. It kind of brings into the concept and into the frame the concept of intersectionality. So I'll be interested to see if another case like Paris shows up again and if the court system changes its mind. You also have Romer, which is also another denial of supplementary retirement pension. Dietrich, Klinke, and Muller are against Germany, and it's for the German government denying reimbursement of their partner's medical expenses because they were in partnerships, not marriage. They argued, I can't get married, so then my same-sex partnership should be seen the same as a heterosexual marriage. And in the case of Hay, Hay was involving a man who went into a registered partnership in France. He worked for a bank that offered married couples or newly married couples a marriage bonus, so a cash bonus, and also a time of special leave for you to get married, for you to go on your honeymoon, to enjoy life. And he applied for it, and they said, yeah, no, sorry, you're not getting married, you got a partnership, not the same thing. And he said, I can't get anything higher than a partnership. It's a same-sex partnership. There is no marriage offered to me. How can I get married? And so he also sued the bank as well. The biggest case currently right now that happened for the ECJ revolves, it's Komen and others versus Insporactu General pentru Emigrare, and it involves this man right here, Adrian Komen. He is a Romanian citizen who married an American named Claiborne Robert Hamilton in Brussels, Belgium, in 2010. He then, in 2012 and 2013, he and his husband looked into moving to Romania and asked the Inspector General of Romania. They told him, generally for Americans, if you come to Europe, you get a 90-day travel visa. So 3 months you can be in Europe without a visa for studying, specific work company, or anything like that. And they were trying to get a visa for Hamilton under spousal privilege, so under family reunification. And Romania said, yeah, we don't recognize same-sex marriage, he's not your husband, 90 days max. And so Komen, of course, sued, and took about 5 years of legal proceedings working its way through the Romanian system up to the ECJ. And the ECJ ruled that Romania cannot deny a third country national, which means someone who's not an EU citizen, who's a spouse of an EU citizen, the privilege of residency only on the basis that they don't recognize same-sex marriage. What does that mean? It basically means that Romania is not forced to allow same-sex marriages. It does not have to allow any same-sex marriages, but it cannot deny a same-sex marriage recognized and done in another EU member state. The EU is known for its principle of solidarity, though often they don't all get along. And basically they said, yeah, no, you have to recognize a marriage done in another country that's in the EU. Otherwise it's just, it messes with the freedom of movement. That's one of the core principles of the EU. And it also messes with the principle of solidarity. Now, this only applies to visas. So this doesn't apply to anything else. This doesn't apply to healthcare. Like once Hamilton gets to Romania, there's no guarantee he's going to actually get the visa. It just says you can't deny him based on Romania not having same-sex marriage. This doesn't mean he's guaranteed then access to healthcare. This doesn't mean any of that. But for a lot of LGBTQ advocates in the EU, this is a step in the door. This is a kick in a slight opening where, okay, the EU has said you have to recognize marriage in another country. Let's see how far this goes. It will probably end up being small step by small step. It'll probably end up being that, just like all the other cases, you're arguing on one specific thing and then it slowly moves forward. Whether you're arguing for a survivor's pension, a widower's pension, access to healthcare, it's probably not going to be that the EU all of a sudden opens up same-sex marriage and forces it on all member states, because it can't, according to its own legal principles. I also enjoy ironies in history. America has a lot of ironies, way too many. One of my favorites is in the US Civil War. It actually started and ended on the same man's property. The guy actually moved after the Civil War started. He's like, I'm getting my family out of here. Moved, and then it still ended on his property, even though it was about 50 kilometers in somewhere else. So why am I talking about this random irony? I remember Kim Davis. So Kim Davis actually went to Romania.
Oh wow.
Kim Davis went there to support a referendum that happened in 2017, so before the Komen case, which wanted to change the Romanian constitution in regards to family. So the Romanian constitution, currently under Article 48, states that marriage is just freely consented marriage between spouses, which spouses is gender neutral. And all of the conservatives freaked out because they realized, oh, wait, we could possibly have a problem. They really don't have a problem. The Romanian Civil Code states that marriage is only between a man and a woman, but it's easier to change the Civil Code than it is to change your constitution. So basically, some very conservative Christian and conservative groups in Romania asked Ms. Davis to come and join them and do a little tour. The referendum did happen, it failed, but the trip was organized by Liberty Council, a conservative organization in the US that deals with promoting evangelical Christian values. So basically a US group paid to go to Romania because since we have same-sex marriage now, they wanted to try to stop anyone else from having it. And this is a picture with her meeting with leaders of the Church of Romania and also with politicians. So what are the future outlooks? So some of that's been kind of heartwarming and some of it's been a little depressing. So what does it look like? So There's currently two legislative options for both the EU and the US. There's the Anti-Discrimination Directive for the EU, and there's the Equality Act in the US. And then you have the EU LGBTI survey, and you also have in the US another Supreme Court case that's coming up that's of real importance. So what is the Anti-Discrimination Directive? We'll start with the EU first this time. Basically, it's the same as the Employment Equality Directive, except for it includes now areas of social protection, which also includes Social Security and healthcare, social advantages, education, and access to supply of goods and services which are available to the public, including housing. This means that public and private organizations cannot discriminate based on these terms. It would honestly be a great opportunity. It would expand LGBTQ and religious, disability, and age non-discrimination policies. However, the directive was actually proposed in 2008, and it actually received a lot of support from the European Parliament, did really, really well. It went under Article 14 that we talked about, the TFEU, so it doesn't go through the same processes as normal legislation. And then it got to the council where it sat for a decade. So it requires a unanimous vote in the council, which means that basically all 28 member states have to agree. And I imagine all of you come from families that, whether it's your found family or your birth family, where you probably can't get 10 people to agree on a subject, let alone 28. So it sat for a decade. But luckily, it's kind of come back up to the surface. In May 2009, there was an article published where now they're stating there's only 2 member states that are currently dragging their heels a bit, still need a unanimous vote. But in October, the European Parliament actually held another debate on it and was kind of like, Council, hey, please move. Like, hi, we're still here. And they noted and particularly pointed out the gaps in EU protections and the need to fill them, especially looking at how the EU Court of Justice had basically been pushing the LGBTQ rights along in specific areas, but also how it itself was sometimes not always following its own previous choices. And it also, there was another debate held in a specific group of the council with a specific group of national ministers. Do I think it will go forward? It sat for a decade, could sit for another decade, but this is at least hopeful that it's come back up and that there's actually movement in it. So EU future outlooks, so EU LGBTI survey. The EU uses LGBTI instead of LGBTQ+, and so LGBTI stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex. And basically, it's a survey that's sponsored by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. And the first survey was done in 2012, and basically they did the survey to try to fill in the gaps that basically there wasn't any information on the experiences of LGBTQ+ individuals in Europe. They had no information, so they said, let's do a survey. They've now done it again in the summer, so 2019. It was held between May and July. It was executed through an online survey, it took about 30 minutes, they had a website. The first survey had 93,000 answers. I do not know, they're still waiting for the results to be published for this one. I have no absolute idea. They haven't given any indication of numbers that have been published, numbers of survey takers, but anyone who was above, I think, the age of 18, and as long as you were an EU member state citizen, or you were in one of the possible candidate countries, you could fill out this survey. And this is the logo from their website for the survey. This would be really great information. The EU is looking at it also to see how, since 2012, if the opinions and experiences of LGBTQ individuals has changed, if they've experienced worse treatment, if there's been a rise in discrimination, if they feel safe as they did in 2012, or if there's been issues. So it should be really interesting once they actually release the data. Now we'll go to the US. So the US, they have the Equality Act, and just like the Anti-Discrimination Act, it's been a while. So it originated in 1974. The idea was there, it never really made it anywhere in the House of Representatives or the Congress. So the current Equality Act would change Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And basically what that means is Title VII is about discrimination in employment. And currently in 1964, they only included it for race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So there is no explicitly listed sexual orientation or gender identity. The issue in some ways becomes, there's ways to manipulate the phrase. So under the Obama administration, they told the Justice Department of the US to interpret sex including sexual orientation and gender identity. The Trump administration said, hey now, no. So they pulled back and said, you should not interpret sex as including sexual orientation and gender identity. And so that's why the Equality Act has kind of gotten a boost in the last year since Trump. It's had two previous versions in the last decade, one in 2015 and one in 2017. They died in committee. Basically, they were read on the House of Representatives floor. Everyone said, great, sent it to the committee to revise it, and then nobody saw it again. So the Equality Act in 2019 passed the House of Representatives with a vote of 236 to 173. Its House of Representatives is currently controlled by the Democratic Party. There were some Republicans who actually crossed the aisle and joined in on this, but the question now becomes the Senate. The Senate is Republican controlled, and it's been referred to a committee in the Senate, so we'll see if it ever sees the light of day outside of the committee again. Even if it did somehow make it through the Senate, President Trump has stated that he would veto it, so he would not sign it into law because it messes with freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. So basically he says, yeah, not being able to discriminate against same-sex couples in your business infringes on religious freedom. So, he's an interesting man, to say the least. So, future outlooks, I was actually at the Supreme Court between Christmas and New Year. They have this really cute little squeezy stress ball that says, U.S. Supreme Court, slow and steady. Very slow and steady. We can say that for a lot of institutions. But yeah, so this is the Supreme Court case. It's a combination of 3 court cases, and it actually deals with the Equality Act. So if the Equality Act actually passed, this would no longer even be considered, because it also involves Title VII, and it's whether or not sexual orientation and gender identity are included under the employment clause for the Title VII. So, a quick background on exactly what these cases are about. So in the case of Zarda and Bostock, they both involve sexual orientation, and the funeral home one involves gender identity. For Zarda, basically he was a skydiving instructor. I don't know, has anyone here gone skydiving? No, okay, neither have I. So when you go skydiving, your instructor is generally strapped to your back, and you're very snug against each other. So if you don't like physical contact, it's not the best experience. And so Zarda was a gay man, and he would tell often his female clients he was gay to try to get them to calm down, back to get strapped to his front. Apparently one woman took offense to it, was homophobic, we don't really know. She complained to her boyfriend, who complained to his boss. And he was then fired for inappropriate workplace conduct. What exactly that means, no one knows. He had a stellar work record, had no issues on the job, had no complaints before, and so he sued the company under the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Unfortunately, Zarda actually died in 2014 in a base jumping accident in Switzerland, so his family's now pushing the case forward. In Bostock versus Clayton County, it's another gay man in a community outside of Atlanta. He worked in the juvenile criminal system for a decade, also had a stellar work record. In 2013, he joined a gay softball league and started expressing to his colleagues, asking if anybody wanted to volunteer and such. 3 months later, he was randomly selected to be looked into for his work records, and they found that apparently some money was missing in one of his accounts and fired him again for inappropriate conduct. Do we know if there was inappropriate conduct? Not really. He, again, claims that he was fired on the basis of his sexual orientation. When it comes to gender identity, for the funeral home case, there is, in 2013, a woman named Amy Stevens. She outed herself to her friends and family as a trans woman and began to make arrangements to have gender affirmation surgery. You may also know it as sex reassignment surgery. And as part of her transition, she told her supervisor, I'm going to follow the handbook that we were given as employees and begin wearing the female required clothing under the handbook guide. She took 2 weeks off from vacation, had emailed her supervisor, got a letter from her employer saying she was fired for inappropriate workplace conduct. Again, so she also had impeccable work records, had no issues. She also sued. But she went through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. All of these cases, why employment is such a big deal is that you saw in the ECJ cases, when you have employment, then also you have benefits, you have health insurance, you have everything. In the US, especially, your employment is almost everything. My family in particular, we always got our health insurance based off my mother's job. If she lost it, there would be no health insurance for your family. You get discounts for cars, phone plans, different things like that. So if you have the opportunity to be discriminated against, it causes a lot of problems. Also, there's multiple US states where you can still be fired for being gay, and there's no legal repercussions. Where I went to university, state of South Carolina, you can still be fired for being gay. So it also causes issues then if you, let's say, got married in North Carolina or any other state. I mean, you can get married in South Carolina too. If you then wanted to file on your health insurance, for example, through your work that you have a spouse, then you've outed yourself to your potential business. So then do you not include your spouse on your health insurance to try to make sure you don't potentially get fired? It causes a lot of issues. So these arguments are really important. They argued the case on October 8th, 2019. Decision is yet to be made. Normally, a Supreme Court decision takes at least about 4 months in the current time. So the question will now be, what does the Supreme Court decide? What do they say in regards to the Civil Rights Act? If they say no, then maybe the Equality Act would get passed, but there's no guarantee of that as well. Since Trump becoming president, he's now appointed 2 more conservative justices. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is holding on by her breath. She's, I think, 87 now. So the court has the opportunity to potentially actually not follow its current progression with LGBTQ rights and potentially vote no. We'll have to see when the decision is made. But hopefully through looking at all of this, you can see that it's very complicated. LGBTQ rights, a lot of it stems from different aspects, and a lot of it is not very clear. I'm from the South, we would say it's as clear as muddy water. It's not super easy to see to the eye, but eventually once you work your way through it, you can see exactly where the holes are. The fact that in the legislative processes in the US, you can, or even in the EU, you can just kind of be like, oh, look it, we got this, fine. And just not look at it, and not say no, not say yes, not say maybe. And also that we've seen, even in the court systems, how sometimes they've given an enthusiastic yes to stuff, and other times they've given enthusiastic no on the same grounds. So thank you for your time, and do you have any questions?
Thank you very much for this great and illuminating talk, and I'm sure there's questions, comments, concerns. I think we learned a lot, and it's interesting to see how this works through cases, of course, in those places you look closer at. So, yeah, questions, comments? Yes, please.
Okay. It was in the beginning when you talked about marriage equality in the EU, you said that some member states have both marriages and partnerships. Like, how would I imagine that? Do they have some partnerships like as a separate thing that's both accessible to heterosexual and same-sex couples, or is it only a thing for homosexual couples?
It actually depends on the country. So the example where it's actually, we love the UK. The UK will be my guinea pig. So the UK actually got sued by a heterosexual couple in the last couple of years. Pardon me, I don't remember the date. And actually got sued for the fact that it did not allow partnerships for heterosexual couples. So they didn't offer them marriage, an option other than marriage. So actually the UK is having to open up partnerships to heterosexual couples. It's a pact. I forget how it is in French, but it's basically it's called a partnership pact. And they had theirs as open to both sexes as well. But in the case, for example, for Hay, it was only if you got married that you were actually given those benefits. So it depends on the member state. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head at the moment, but I know, for example, for France and the UK, their partnerships are open for both.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, no, but
Yes.
now you mentioned that one case where there were these 2 men and I think the theater association.
Yeah.
Or no, or it was the other one where you said it was both based on sex and on age. Like, how does this work?
So I can go into the whole long story if you want to hear it. I tried to sum it up. So basically, Paris, he was a professor and a lecturer at the Trinity College in Dublin since 1972, I believe it was. And with him, he had a partner for that entire amount of time. Let me double check my dates just so I don't screw it up. And they couldn't get married in Ireland because Ireland didn't allow same-sex marriage until, quote me if I'm wrong, 2015? I think it's 2015 as well. And so basically in regards to that, he actually was a double citizen though, so he was English and Irish. So he had the opportunity actually and did with his partner at the time, go to England and get married when he couldn't have a partnership before Ireland allowed it. And so once he went there, he went to the UK in 2009, and then in 2010 he applied for early retirement through Trinity College. Trinity College had very strict guidelines when it came to a survivor's pension. Basically, you had to be under the age of 60 when you entered into your survivor, you had to, for your spouse, you had to be under the age of 60, and it had to be, at that point, it was only marriage. You couldn't be a filed partnership. So he married so he got a partnership in the UK when he was 63 years old, so in 2009. The problem was then he applied for this survivor's pension, and he was not able to get it because they said he was too old because he went and got a partnership in the UK, and he was 63 at the time, but he said, but Ireland in that time period passed actually a partnership law, and his partnership was recognized 12 days after he retired. So basically what ended up happening was he got screwed by the system. So he had to get married, and he had to get into his partnership before he was 60. He couldn't get into a partnership in Ireland at all, so he went to the UK, did it at 63 in the UK, but wasn't recognized as a partnership until he was 67. So he kind of got screwed on both aspects, but you needed both discrimination bases in order to prove it, and the ECJ basically said, you have to prove one discrimination on its own in order for it to be discrimination. You can prove them both separately, it could be on two bases, but you can't use one to prove the other. They have to be able to stand alone, which is where they got absolutely executed by any law critic who's written any commentaries on them in the last couple of years because of the fact it's an obvious case of discrimination. He couldn't get married, that wasn't an option, and then you said, okay, well, if you get in a partnership, but he couldn't access partnership until after he was 60 anyway, because of his sexual orientation. So he basically got in a double bind. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
You started your talk, you mentioned that public opinion with respect to LGBTQ rights has changed radically in the past 20 years. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what are the factors that sort of contribute to this?
A lot of it, the factors that have contributed to it is there was a really famous politician in the US called Harvey Milk. There's a film about him on Netflix if you care to watch it, it's about 2 hours. And he was in San Francisco in the late 70s. He was unfortunately assassinated, and basically he really was one of the first openly gay politicians in the US, and he always would give these speeches, I'm Harvey Milk and I've come to recruit you, and he would talk about how you have to come out. You can't hide in the shadows. Hiding in the shadows just lets all of the stereotypes, all of the misconceptions about being gay fester. They need to know that we're librarians, politicians, police officers. They need to know that it's your brother, it's your friend. And he really pushed that. So you start seeing in the late 70s and then into the 80s and 90s, this push to come out. Throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they also had LGBTQ marches on Washington. There was, I believe, at least 5. The nice picture of the gentleman in front of the Lincoln Memorial, that was from one of the last ones in the early 2000s. So it was an aspect of people actually coming out and people seeing, one of the stereotypes in the US, particularly with LGBTQ members, is that they're pedophiles. And they could see that, which is inappropriate, people could see, oh wait, that's Fred. I know Fred, he's the florist. Fred's not a pedophile. Like, Fred watches my kids. Fred, watches my dog. I live next door to Fred. People's eyes were open to seeing, oh wait, this is not how things are. The other thing was also, there was a really big push, especially in the US, to say we're just like you. So rather than saying we're like this completely different community, they would say, we're just like you, like love is love. We also want access to marriage. We're the same as you, we go to the same stores as you do. We, cut your grass. We cut our grass with a mower the same way you do. We like to watch TV shows. Media also played an influence. Ellen DeGeneres' show came on in the US. Media started being more open to LGBTQ characters. It did start its own strain then of stereotypes in regards to like the flaming homo and different things like that, or the lipstick lesbian, but it opened up America's eyes to see, wait, it's not, like, it's more common than you think. So I think that is one of the main aspects that really pushed it. It was very public. Now there's a little bit backlash of almost that you're in our faces. I've heard it from a lot of people who are especially older, a lot of Trump supporters, who say, you gay people are everywhere, like you're always in my face. Because they feel that, because they've come out more and you see them more prevalently, that in some ways it's taking up space for everyone else. So in that sense, yeah, I would say it's predominantly one because of the work of coming out, and then also the idea of trying to compare yourself to the normal quote unquote person.
Well, let me share a little story from a year and a half ago. I was in Minnesota on vacation, met old friends, and they told me in 1970, University of Minnesota was the first student government solely elected by a group of students who ran as gay student group for the government. 1970. And the president of the student government was gay, and he wanted to marry his partner. The marriage request was denied in Minneapolis. I was told in the Twin Cities. I went to the neighboring Iowa. He persuaded a person so they got legally married because on the legal grounds that the American law or the Iowa law didn't specify man and woman, just specified two people have to get married. It was generally assumed from ages on that just men and women were married. So it was the first gay that was never taken back. I think that should be part of the history of
I've never actually heard that story, so...
of course, because most people think North Central America is not so important. The important things happen in San Francisco or the East Coast and stuff like that. So it's an interesting story that probably should be kept in mind or so.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it was the first gay student government also.
Yeah.
It's an interesting story.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. I've had friends who've gone to the University of Minnesota, but not that.
Yeah, maybe I completely forgot there, but let me ask you another question, right? I just talked recently on the phone to my godchild in the United States, Karen, and she says, she knows she's bisexual, and now she said to me on the phone, I have a new partner. The partner is transsexual. And interesting now, the linguistic question I have now is, how do you refer to your partner, I asked her. He said, well, he himself refers to himself as him or they, in the plural and the singular one. I don't have too much access anymore to American culture and so on to understand this kind of modern developments.
Yeah,
Can you characterize, how would people refer to them? There's this kind of language.
So pronouns are the really big topic now. So you have obviously like the name that you're chosen to, I mean, my name's Natalie, I go by Natalie. My parents gave me that name, I'm content with that name, but that's because that name has always matched my gender identity. I identify with the sex I was assigned at birth. For other individuals, it's not the same. So probably with this partner, they might not have, the gender identity might not match the sex that they were assigned at birth, and they have the opportunity to basically, in the US right now, one of my best friends is trans as well, who I went in my bachelor with. His name is Quill. He uses they, them pronouns, and it's basically a way of being gender neutral. So in the US, we are not as gendered, English is not as gendered of a language as German, which in some ways is really a great opportunity for transgender individuals in the US. So he and she is obviously very much in the binary of male and female, and so he uses they, them as a way of saying, I don't belong to either of those groups. They is the pronoun I choose to use. I mean, we use it in cultures, we already use it in the English language. For example, oh, whose is that? Oh, it's theirs. So it's already in the vocabulary, it's just not maybe as pronounced. ways to kind of start to be more aware of it is, for example, on name tags for different organizations, you'll put your name and then you'll put your pronouns. So I would put Natalie and then she, hers, so you know which pronouns to use for me. But there's other people who use different pronouns. In American English, there's also a movement for Zir. I know about 5 people who use those who are either gender nonconforming or transgender. But the point of the pronouns is so that way the individual feels comfortable, and that's the most important thing. You want to treat people with a level of respect, and those pronouns make them feel whole. And so I just try, if someone tells me their pronouns and that's what they choose to use, I use them. Because that's just respecting them as an individual.
So I asked Karen, how's them doing on the phone?
Yeah. How are they doing? How are they doing? What's their day like? Tell them I said hello.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. In the 1970s, we had I think she's still alive, Monique Wittig, a French writer, who wrote these novels avoiding pronouns like il and elle and using the plural in the stories.
Plural, yeah.
But now these things have come true, so to speak, right? That people themselves refer to them in the plural, and that's quite interesting.